I don't know if you've ever been part of a group that were really well known for something particular. Perhaps a sports team that had a particular song, and sometimes friendship groups have like a particular like a secret handshake or something like that. Maybe your family are well known for something particular. When I was a child, my family had some lovely family friends who we used to go and visit maybe 2 or 3 times a year. It was always really fun going to see them. They had really good toys, lovely big garden. They have go-karts in their garden, and there was always a lot of banter, particularly around the dinner table. And we would often, particularly me and my mum and my sister, would spend entire meal times hysterically laughing, like entire meal times in laughter. And actually, my maiden name was Murphy. They when they said, "Oh, the Murphys are coming," they didn't actually refer to us as the Murphys. They referred to us as the Laughers, because that is what we'd become known as in their house. The Laughers are coming for lunch today, and because that's what we became known as. I suppose it could have been much, much worse. I'll take the Laughers. We're looking at our series, continuing our series on our story, and we're looking at the big story told throughout the Bible and working out where we fit in with this story. And we looked at creation 2 weeks ago, how God made us not just good, but very good. Last week we looked at the fall, about when people started to get stuff wrong, but that's not the end of the story. And today we're looking at God's people, which is the story that basically continues through the whole of the rest of the Old Testament. Is the story of God's people. What makes them distinctive? What makes them known as God's people? So creation was 2 chapters. That happens in 2 chapters, Genesis 1 and 2. The fall happens in Genesis chapter 3, so that's just 1 chapter. God's people, the next bit of the story, is actually over 900 chapters. But don't worry, guys, you're not going to miss your roast. We're just going to be looking at a little passage from Deuteronomy chapter 11. And Deuteronomy is one of the books of the law, one of the books where God gave his people instructions that made them know what was going to make them distinctive, was going to make them God's people. And we're looking at a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 11 where Moses is telling the people all about the law, all about the things that God would have them do to be his people. So we're going to read from verse 13 to 15. So if you faithfully obey the commands I'm giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your corn, new wine, and olive oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. So the Israelites are a farming people. They're just about to come into the land which God has promised them, the promised land that God's given them. And they're going to receive blessings. If they follow the Lord, if they obey the commands he's given them, they're going to receive blessings. There's similar passages of this throughout the Old Testament, actually. And this passage particularly is focusing on the land, rain and grain and wine and olive oil, all the blessings that God's going to give them for following his instructions. But in order for that to happen, they need to obey God's commands. They need to love God first. They need to put God first. And then will come the blessing. That is the message of the Old Testament. God saying, if you put me first, then the blessing will come. And not just for them, but actually the Israelites, God's people, God promises that they are not going to be blessed by him, but they're going to be a blessing for the whole world. Through his people, Israel, the whole world are going to be blessed. And actually, that's part of our story today. We're not necessarily part of this family, the Jewish family descended from Abraham, but we have been blessed because of this family, the family that Jesus came from. And through this family, through Jesus, the whole world is going to be blessed. So we're part of that story even now. If we put God first, if the Israelites put God first, and if we do as well, then blessings are guaranteed. I have to say that an easy life is not guaranteed. And we all know that bad things happen to good people. And some of us will also be able to testify that when we're pursuing God, when we're living God's way, when we're loving God first, and the enemy really wants to get in and ruin that, wants to knock us off course. We're almost guaranteed problems and struggles, partly because of that spiritual rattle, partly because we get stuff wrong. We talked about that last week, partly because other people in our lives get stuff wrong. We hurt each other. We're guaranteed blessing. We're guaranteed battles, but we're also guaranteed blessing. God's blessing, God's love, his favor, his kindness, his presence with us. When we love God, we put him first, we're guaranteed that as well. And not only for us, but for all the nations in the world, all the people surrounding us will be blessed because of that as well. We're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 16 and 17. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce. And you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving to you. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods. Now, for Israel, these other gods were typically objects, models made of wood or stone or metal. They might have been treasured statues to them, and they were worshipped instead of God. We don't see that in quite the same way now, a spiritual act of worship to an object. But that was the idols that the Israelites were putting in front, that the Israelites were at risk of putting ahead of God, of loving before God. And actually, as soon as they start worshipping something else, as soon as they start prioritizing something else instead of God, God's not able to bless them. They're going to miss out on what God has for them because they're not putting God first. They're not connecting with God. They're not going to receive the blessings from God. And it's the same for us. As soon as we start putting other things in front of God, prioritizing those things, we're going to miss out on what God has for us. Now, idols for us, as I said, are not likely to be objects made of wood or stone or metal. But there are things in our lives that will stop us living God's way, that will get in the way of our relationship with God, will get in the way of will become a bigger priority in our lives than God. It happens really easily. This passage says, be careful or you'll be enticed to other idols. You might have been more aware of this in lockdown. Sometimes the lockdown and the change of pace reveals some of this more so than in when life was normal. I don't really know what normal means anymore, but we might have experienced this in lockdown. Things that can get in the way of us living God's way, maybe money. Sometimes it's because we just love money and we love being able to have things and buy things. But sometimes actually it's the opposite. It's the concern about money. We get so concerned about God, about our provision, about what we've got, that that can eclipse what God's got for us. It can eclipse our trust in God. Sometimes the Old Testament's got loads of laws and instructions all about money and possessions, trying to keep the Israelites free from making money and possessions an idol in their lives. Maybe it's work. We all know people who describe themselves as workaholics. We're called to be people who work. That's in Genesis chapter 1. But we're also called to be people who rest. That's in Genesis chapter 1 as well. And the Old Testament's got loads of instructions about how to keep the Sabbath holy, how to make space in our weeks, in our schedules for God, for rest, for enjoying the creation, not just being part of the work that we're called to, but also being part of enjoying what God has given us, spending time with God. Work can easily get in the way when actually we're called to be people who rest as well. Maybe it's relationships, intimate relationships or sex, or maybe family relationships or friendships. It's very easy for our relationships to get in the way of us following God, for them to become more important. We talked about some of this a couple of weeks ago when we thought about identity and some of the things that get in the way of our identity being rooted in God. Relationships can do that. There's loads and loads of instructions about relationships and throughout the books of the law. The Israelites needed a lot of help with that in making sure that God was their primary relationship. Their relationship with God came first, and then all their other relationships came second. It might be physical beauty or our health or our fitness or any other number of really good things that God has blessed us with. They're not bad things, but they are good things that can get in the way of us loving God sometimes. And the Israelites were sometimes called to make a hard choice. And sometimes we're called to make a hard choice. It might not be as simple as smashing up an idol. There was quite a lot of idol smashing that happened throughout the Old Testament as the Israelites struggled to follow God and then came back to God and then just the difficult journey that they had. That's why actually it's over 900 chapters, because they had such a difficult time following God. And there was lots of idol smashing. So it might be as simple as smashing something, just removing something from our lives. But I don't think that's always as simple as that for us. I think sometimes we need to recalibrate ourselves, bring ourselves before the Lord again, try and bring God back into the center, ask God to help us to follow him, to love him first, and then we'll experience the blessing. And then that blessing will ripple out to those all around us. Here's a few people who I think have made a hard choice in many situations and have decided to live God's way, have decided to follow what they feel like God is asking them to do. And the first one is Gary Grant. It's a little picture of him coming up. He's the CEO of The Entertainer, the toy shop chain. There he is. Oh, look, he looks like a CEO of a toy shop chain there. Now, The Entertainer are a little bit different to lots of other retailers, and it's been a tough year for retailers, high street retailers this year. But The Entertainer, Gary Grant, he's a Christian, he decided none of his shops were going to open on Sundays. And he's also decided to tithe, to give away 10% of his profits. And that's quite unusual, I would say, in the business world, not to open on Sundays. And it would have been very, very easy for him to prioritize the financial gain that you get from having your shops open on Sundays and to keep that profit to himself. But actually, he wanted to live God's way. He wanted to put God first. And actually, they've been really successful. Again, I don't know how this year's going to go for them. They've been in the news a little bit over the last few months. But last year's profits were good, and they've grown extremely quickly. He's got 160 shops nationwide now that he's in charge of. And he decided to live God's way, and he's experienced blessing because of that. I think his staff have experienced blessing as well, as they're encouraged to have work and rest in their lives. And this is a brilliant man called Brian Stevenson. And if you haven't listen to his Desert Island Discs, you're a podcast listener, it's incredible. And he's written a book as well. And he's a lawyer. And when he was a lawyer, he decided that he was going to represent a man who was on death row. He met this man as one of the jobs that he was given when he was working for the state of Alabama. And he went to visit this man in prison. And he decided that he wanted to represent him. He wanted him to have a fair trial. He wanted him to have legal representation. And later that week, the judge overseeing the case rang him and really discouraged him from taking this case and representing this man, Walter McMillan. Really discouraged him. He said, "I can't believe that you're taking this case. And I don't think that's a good idea." He didn't think this case was going to go well, that all the hearsay surrounding this man was so dark and so difficult. He just didn't want to see this young lawyer get brought into all of that. And it would have been very easy for Brian McLaren to choose the success route, to choose the cases that were going to make his work a success. But instead, he decided to stand up for justice, to do the thing that God was calling him to do, to be a lawyer who upheld justice first. And he put God first and did. And actually, he has seen great success. He's actually seen the law change to make life fairer for prisoners. His organization is doing amazing, amazing things. And I think that's partly because he decided to put God first in that decision. And this is a man called Louis Zamparini. I listened to his story earlier this week. And he is, there he is. He is a survivor of horrific torture as a prisoner of war in Japan during the Second World War. Extraordinary story of adventures and real hardship. And later in his life, he became a Christian. And in the moment of him becoming a Christian, when he heard the message of God's forgiveness that's available to all of us, none of us need to struggle on our own, that God's with us and willing to give us freedom. He realized that message of forgiveness was something that he was called to as well. And he actually went on to meet many of his captors and his torturers and offer them his forgiveness, redeem that horrendous relationship that had happened. And it would have been very easy for him to choose anger or bitterness, to choose what might be seen as an easier way. Not stepping out and doing the hard thing. It's much harder to forgive than to fight sometimes. But actually, he's chosen to do it God's way. He's chosen to put God first and step into what God has for him, step into God's blessing. And he's experienced so much peace in his life as a result of that decision, so much goodness. God's been able to bless him because he lived God's way, because he put God first. He made the hard choice. It's made a difference. All of those three men, it's made a real difference in their lives. And it's made a difference. This blessing has rippled out into the people that surround them as well. We're going to read the next bit from Deuteronomy 11, starting at verse 18. And this is how we do it. This is how we put God first. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be many in the land that the Lord swore to give your ancestors, as many as the days are above the earth. And this is not just about post-it notes with scriptures on it that can really help us. This is about our whole lives being connected with God, being connected with his law. The Israelites were called to immerse themselves in the law, in the scriptures, their hearts and minds and hands and foreheads and children and at home and when you're walking and when you're sleeping and when you're waking up, and for generations after them, their whole lives, their whole identity, their whole existence is called to be immersed in the law. And we're living in a different time now, where Jesus has set us free from the pressure to keep the law, actually, because we know that we can have freedom and forgiveness. But we are called to immerse ourselves in God. Where the Israelites immersed themselves in the law, we're called to immerse ourselves in God and let the Holy Spirit come and meet us and help us and guide us so that we can live God's way, we can experience God's blessing, and we can see that blessing rippling out to other people. Tim Keller says, to confront the idols in our lives, we need repentance. We need to recognize what's going on. We need to see what's getting in the way and turn away from them. And we need rejoicing. We need to connect with God. We need to experience his goodness, know his Holy Spirit with us, see the blessing. So we need repentance and rejoicing. And we're going to have a chance to pray a little bit later so we can do that. I've shared a bit of my story around identity before, but many years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I was in a relationship with a brilliant man, who I am now married to. He's still brilliant. And it was starting to get really tough. And I was getting really upset because he wasn't able to put me first in the relationship. And actually, if I'm honest, I wasn't really able to put him first in the relationship at that point. We were both having a hard time, and we both had hurt feelings. My feelings were hurt, but also I had this fear of what would happen if the relationship finished, if it ended. I'd feel like such a failure. I was sort of holding this relationship up as a success opportunity in my life. And as I was grumpy with the Lord that Andy wasn't putting me first, I heard those words and realized that actually he wasn't meant to be putting me first. He was meant to be putting God first. And I was meant to be putting God first. And actually, in that moment of praying that God, we'd both be able to put God first, the pressure was released from our relationship. We were both able to experience God blessing. We both had stuff going on. We needed healing and God to lead us through that stuff. And it gave God space to work when we weren't holding up this other thing in front of the Lord, when we were able to focus on God. So the things that get in the way don't need to be the end of the story. There's blessing available to us. There's hope. There's always a second chance with Jesus. The Spirit's always available for us to help us as we're living God's way. And maybe you've got some stuff that's getting in the way at the moment. Maybe it's some of the stuff I've already talked about, or maybe it's other stuff that you know is getting in the way of you living God's way, of you being distinctively God's people, being known for loving God first. We're going to pray in a moment, because actually that's not the end of the story. The stuff that gets in the way isn't the end of the story. What if we were God's people who were known for our love for God, who were known for living God's way, experiencing blessings, everything that he got for us because we were able to put him first? And what if that blessing, we saw that blessing ripple out to those around us? If our friends started to notice the difference, if the relationships in our lives, the pressure was taken off them because we were focused on the Lord instead of on those things in our lives. If we were able to make better decisions, life-giving decisions, we were able to have life to the full. Imagine what would happen to our town if Christians all over our town were able to live God's way, were able to see God lifted high, we're experiencing God's love and his peace and his joy, and seeing that ripple out to all the people around us.